Okay, thank you everyone for this wonderful opportunity, and thank you very much, Professor Song, for this wonderful opportunity. I hope that everybody can hear my presentation. I have received such a warm welcome from Professor Song. It's titled Colonial Vernacular, Post-Colonial Residence, Diasporic Language and the Power of Contestation. Well, when I present about my research, I usually like to start with a story. And the story here, we are talking about sojourn. In what ways are we talking about movement of people? And we can go back into time and history during the colonial period that connects the two lands of Korea and Japan through the colonial occupation of Korea by the Japanese Empire. When I talk about sojourn, I like to implement subjective personal stories of people, because when we talk about history, are we not only talking about the timelines and happenings, but we are talking about the actual movement of people and their lives and their development. So here, when we look at up on the upper left-hand corner is a colonial Korea, a picture that one of my first generation Omonis had in her box that she had always kept with her. Below is when she was 17 with her husband moving to Japan. In the middle of the picture is a woman that I interviewed, and she grew up in Japan basically, but she was born in Korea, so she is a first generation. And during that time of her life in Japan with a kimono and her transition, here below in the middle is the B-29. As the B-29 the bombers were flying overhead, but still they were having their marriage ceremony. On the upper right corner is the Koreans who went back to North Korea, thinking that North Korea repatriation would be to their homeland. And here on the right-hand side is the repatriation, the ship that took them back to Korea from Japan. So when we talk about history, we always have to think about the origin. And origin is usually the beginning of the story. And when we look at the Genesis, we look at a brief historical background, and everything starts from this colonial period of 1910 to 1945, the migration, the voluntary and involuntary labor force, etc. And also how to adjust these massive amount of Koreans who were stuck in Korea after the war. And they were then casted from being Japanese citizens to aliens. So they were registered as aliens. Many people thought, should we go back to our homeland? But then the Korean War happened that divided the country. Then there was the formal loss of Japanese nationality. Then repatriation of Koreans, mostly many of them who went back to North Korea from 1959 to 1976. Permanent residency. So now we are getting a picture of people who kind of look upon Japan to be a permanent place of residence, domicile. And then we look at the transition of their political identity in terms of community and organization, and then the branching out of the Zainichi diasporic identity in Japan. So when we look at colonial vernacular, we have to kind of look at where is a lot of the problem starting for a diasporic community. And we see it in the vernacular. And the resonance of that vernacular from the colonial period remains to the present of the images of the other. So when we talk about Chosen or Choson, we understand in the Chinese character to be a place, a locale, a nation. But when we look at the katakana, the Japanese script, the katakana script that actually points to foreignness, we see this category of fute, insolent. And so senjin is more like this kind of derogatory term. So then the stereotypical images of the colonizer, of the colonized starts. And this resonates even to the present. And we are going to see how it does that. We go back into time into 1923 when there was a massive catastrophe in Japan during the Kanto earthquake. And there, after the massive earthquake, the scapegoating of the foreigners began, and that is the scapegoating of the colonized other within Japan. So there was a massacre of thousands of Koreans during that time, with different kind of rumors that these insolent Koreans were setting fires and making more catastrophe within the nation state. And on the bottom, I decorate that with the actual lives of the colonized other. So here we see in media during that time of this idea of this insolent Koreans who are starting this kind of massive unrest within the community. Then we kind of connect this to the reference of the Zainichi diaspora community. Here we see a lot of the intergenerational transition, and that is for the first generation, we see a very distinct identity that is very clear of Chosenjin or Kankokujin. There's no question about it. But for the second generation, then we see the branching out of this diasporic identity from Zainichi Kankoku Chosenjin or Zainichi Korean to use the hyphenated identity categorization, Korea K Nihonjin, Japanese, new Japanese who've naturalized, who are of the Korean roots, Shin Nihonjin, the new Japanese, but also we see mixed heritage. And then another way to look upon their identity is of the Zainichi diaspora community who have roots within the Chosen Peninsula. Then we look upon the diasporic language and intergenerational perception of how this idea, this category, neutral category of Chosen and Chosenjin, and the not so very neutral, more skewed look of the Chosen and Chosenjin, and how the stigma really disseminates into not only the mainstream Japanese society, but also within the Korean Zainichi diasporic community themselves. So when we look at the first and the second generation vis-a-vis the Japanese society and also the Zainichi community, I refer to Charles Cooley's Looking Glass Self, where the second generation, who is the intermediary, looks at themselves and their second generation, so they are Japan-born. They look at themselves in a mirror, and then in the back of their mirror, they're looking at the reflection of the first generation and also the way that the Japanese society is looking at the first generation, their parents. And so from this, they internalize a lot of this transferable societal stigma and the stereotypes of the colonial other. In all of my work, I look at writings and also narratives of women. And so when we look at the writings and narratives of women, we look upon these categories of mother, daughter, woman, person. So the ideal, the picture of the grand omoni is central to a lot of the second generation and also the third and then the younger generation. The woman is the root and the center of the family and their lives. We see here Western Anglophone literature on Zainichi Korean, especially focused on the women, but also on the bottom are literature that are written by women about themselves. So majority are second and third generation who are able to now write and narrate about their mothers and vis-a-vis their own womanhood. Let me just read with you just a little bit of how this kind of inner conflict happens within the diaspora community, especially when this categorization, the stigma is within their identity construction. Chosen was something detestable, one of the women wrote, Kim Chang-sen. She wrote as something one did not want to touch. It was not that I was ashamed of being a garbage collector's daughter. In the novels that I started reading, there were stories of parents and children who were poor but huddled together. My parents spoke in their mother tongue. For me, who could not understand Chosen language, it was a mere rough foreign language, and I was irritated with my parents who could not get better in their Japanese. Below, Chosenjin are dirty, Chosenjin are barbaric, Chosenjin are sneaky. The notion of Chosenjin with a katakana form that the Japanese ruling class implemented into the Japanese folk as a way to accomplish the Meiji 100 years long-range strategy was me exactly and described my parents. So we see the way in which gender and also ethnic identity and the identity of the diasporic other formulates into the way that they categorize themselves. This poem was written by a Zainichi Korean second generation born, but she uses a Japanese name. But we see the transition in the way in her 20s and 30s, and also when she herself becomes a mother, how this revolves in her. She writes, the woman, person, who bore me was a Chosenjin. The woman conceived me in the defeated country of Japan. The woman, wrapped in the chogori and chimang, felt dizzy in the country of Japan. The woman, wrapped in the chogori and chimang, could only speak the Chosen language. The woman, person, who bore me was a Chosenjin. When I was growing up, the woman spoke broken Japanese. Somehow it was Japanese accented by Chosen dialect. From my mouth came nothing but Japanese. My body was wrapped in red kimono and white tabi socks. From my mouth came Japanese spoken like a Japanese. The woman, person who bore me was a Chosenjin. When I was around 20, that woman died. The woman, wrapped in the chogori and chima, spoke lowly Japanese, accented by Chosen dialect. Until death, a lowly Chosen woman. Until death, the wrinkles on her face were deep and dark. The woman, person who bore me was a Chosen Jin. Around the time I was a bride, from my mouth came nothing but Japanese. From my body came nothing but the scent of Japan. My body gave off only a refined scent. The man who married me smelled the same. The man who married me spoke refined Japanese. When I had a child, somehow from my mouth came Japanese accented by Chosen dialect. Somehow my body smelled like a lowborn. The woman, person who bore me was a Chosen Jin. I think that it's very obvious where her transition is from the way that she does a mimicry, for example, in Homi Baba's form of mimicry, but also at the same time, how she comes full circle. And when she has a child of her own, she starts to accept this colonial uh, um, identity. Now, let's once again look upon mother and how mother translates into language. Beyond the curse of national language untangling the tongue, Bogo, mother tongue, Bokokugo, native language. Now we see emotions within our language. Kato, inner conflict. Kusetsu, refracted, warped. Then we see a way of accommodating a lot of this inner conflict into Kochamaza, broken vernacular. Champong, mixed. Here, Pakwami analyzes this concept. She writes, unquestionably accepting the primacy of language of the nation state as one of the defining factors of being a citizen prevents alternative and diverse experiences of language, identity, and belonging. Birthplace and birthright, no right for those who do not fit the mold of a true citizen. A difference in one's name or citizenship brings one's belonging and nativity into question, even if the person speaks the language fluently. One's difference is emphasized as soon as it is revealed or discovered. For second generation of Zainichi who have not naturalized and who speak Japanese as their mother tongue, the Japanese language highlights a quasi-division between the Bogo of Japanese and Bokokugo, literally translated as motherland's language of Korean. But how about for the third, fourth, and fifth generation? Bob writes, I thought it was funny that here I was trying to memorize and learn to speak Korean in Japan, but I couldn't help wondering, how is this going to help me? How does speaking Korean help my parents, my siblings? I knew early on that I didn't want to become like my first generation parents. I didn't want to live like my siblings who were barely making it. Sure, they were doing the right things, keeping with the language and tradition of Korea. But these things didn't help. So I studied and studied, not Korean, but English. I knew that would be my key. English, mastering English would give me the kind of power I wouldn't get from learning Korean, even fluently. I knew that English would be the future, so I studied it as hard as I could. So here she finds another alternative. Here, Yi talks about Uriman, and for her, it's a little bit different. Uriman is my mother tongue, but in actuality, it is not for someone like me, who was born and raised and educated in Japan and does not speak Uriman. Although I want to call it my mother tongue, I could not do so with pride. That is why I often thought not being able to speak in my mother tongue was embarrassing, irritating, though I think people who have been raised like I have would be able to understand. To be fluent in Uriman has been a challenge throughout my life. It is not as simple or innocent as wanting to learn the language of my country. It is something that cannot be explained in one utterance, but is much more complex. I feel increasingly distant from Uriman. I tell myself that even if one is unable to speak the language, as long as that person has a strong ethnic consciousness, one could live as a proud Korean and be accepted. There are many Zainichi second and third generation who feel the same. It is the language of my land, but at the same time, it is not. Here we look upon ways in we can do contestation of this kusetsu, this kind of inner conflict, and of this colonial other, the broken vernacular. Gochamase and Champong, mixed Japanese and Korean. Creolized vernacular of survival, definitely for the first generation. Language of everyday and the ethnic enclaves and Japanese society. Imperfect accent to speech was a reminder, though, of an inferior status in the mainstream for the second generation. First generation's broken vernacular and accent to speech symbolized connection to Korean roots, and in a sense, a discomfort and turmoil expressed as Butsetsu. Here we see a poem. It's called Ningu. And this was written by a second generation as she reflects upon her mother's reflection. Ningo biting the flesh of an apple, the drip of blood so clear. Ningo and not Ringo. Mother who says Namiami Tabutsu. And here we see the Japanese script of katakana to kind of give that nuance of foreignness of what her mother speaks. Namu, then here we see the Chinese character. This is kind of like an interstitial space. Here in Namu Amutabutsu, we see hiragana, which is a more of a closer to the Japanese form, the Japanese script. Here, the supra permeating the full throat, she writes, condensing and knitting the swelling chant on the tongue. Not filling the fist, but the gut. So how her mother utilized a lot of this broken vernacular to feed the family, boiled refuse along the river, boiled intestines in the street. So then, at that time, diasporic Koreans had no money. They could not really enjoy, for example, meat. So they would have to instead eat intestines. Mother under the eaves, crouching the chest. Dingo, she used to sell apples. A mound for 100 yen. Won't you buy some here? Kotenka. This kotenka shows the Kansai, Western Osaka dialect. And here we see how her mother incorporates into her speech of accented broken vernacular with a regional dialect of Osaka for her survival. So here we see Pakwami and others trying to really depict what is Zainichi toshite no Chosen Nihongo. So Zainichi Chosengo toshite no Nihongo, Zainichi Chosen language. So poet Kim Shi-jung writes, this is his best weapon. This for second generation is their best weapon to contest the beautified, the mainstream Japanese language. So here we have fragmented vernacular, gochamase, creating an alternative discursive space through multiplicity of expressions, conveying diversity of language and diasporic history. Heavily accented and derivative form of language is a powerful way of protesting and dissenting normal speech used by the majority. Now let's look upon the generational shift and negotiating the difference. We see the intergenerational transitional narrative from roots, the stigma of the roots, then coming out. This is who I am. This is who my parents are. I can't change it. Then we see the third level of consciousness or awareness where they say, difference, agency, resistance, community is my way of contestation. Let's look at another example of Aigo. Here, we see a creative emotional interplay of cultural locution of Aigo. First generation's vernacular of Aigo was something that expressed a lot of emotions, including sadness, lamentation, fear, surprise, shock, joy, and jubilation. Aigo within the colonial and post-colonial context, second generation is a very cultural term of mother. To the Japanese, though, a parody of Chosenjin, a form of degradation. So when they wanted to refer to the Korean colonial other days to say Aigo, right? Second generation's reconstruction of the cultural locution. Aigo written in the Chinese script means grief, sorrow. Logo is the cry out, sakebu. Aigo then becomes overwhelming sadness mixed together with love. Then we see Aigo, how the second generation now utilizes this Aigo of sadness to actually say, I understand your story now. And then they write the Chinese character of love and narration. So Aigo expounds the complexities of love within narration and also being narrated to, that they are receptive of the narration of the first generation. Here we see a spanning out of the network community of shared diasporic fragmentation. Fragmented and disjointed diasporic language, could this be an alternative? Joining us who share common roots of diasporic origin of Korean diaspora throughout the world? Could we communicate using broken and mixed language of origin like how I did with Songhun this morning? No? Can we look upon disjointed language of origin roots to be not correct usage, but The fragmentation, accent, and usage reveal our individual diasporic experience and our histories. Like me within the States, now living in Japan, Songhoon in Germany, Korea, Japan. Yeah. So we can see the possibilities of this to debunk the power of standard speech, to contest the hegemonic correct speech, revealing difference through accent and intonation, crossing the boundaries of native and non-native speech, contesting social hegemonic powers by sounding different, creating and intermixing our own accents formed through life experiences. Now we look upon colonial vernacular to post-colonial resistance, from subversive speech acts of the first generation and the second to public contestation. We see here in the modern period, in our current situation, where on the streets in Japan, there are shouts of, I just want to kill them all now, referring to Koreans. Go back to your country. This is Japan, not your country. And we were able to see a massive amount of hate speech, which has now gone underground. But then we also see at the same time, when there's massive amount of this kind of negative movement, how do younger generation of women, especially third generation, contest these kind of hate speech? Now they have the power of their speech and the law to contest. Here, a third generation woman who sued a very large real estate company for their discrimination, the hate speech. Another 2.5 generations, Zainichi Korean, who sued a very large internet platform for their hate speech against her and also Zainichi Koreans. Here we see major action going on in the regions of Kawasaki, the former enclave of Zainichi Koreans. Here, a woman and her son contesting through law hate speech. Once again, here, intergenerational movements and collectives of first, second, third, and fourth generation and beyond, and also Japanese allies who say, not in our city, not in our locale, we're not going to have racism and hate speech here. Now we see younger generations. How are they performing this verbal dissidence? Here we see Funi. Funi goes to many different parts of the world these days as a Zainichi Korean and is very political in his expression of, by doing rap, of the history. So for him, he tells the story of the first generation through his rap. Another, this is also Jindog. Jindog is short for Jindoke. And his rapping is the cool effect of ethnic enclave landscape, redefining Chosenjin in the rap verse Chosenjin Buraku. So before, Chosenjin was looked upon as the colonial other and the stigma, but now Jindog and other rappers are taking this idea of Chosenjin and they are bringing coolness into this. So when he raps, he does a lot of the rapping of the Ikuno, the Osaka enclave. Let's show a little bit of where this rap lives in the...
やっぱそういう抜け出したいっていうか、ネガティブなところからあわよくばその成功して金を稼いでみたいな、やっぱ一番最初の動機ですね。
東京と横浜に挟まれてて、その間に川崎があるんですけど、どっちのスタイルも入って面白い具合で、このなんかちょうどうまい具合でいいとこ取りでなんかみんな先輩とかもなんかやってました。
直接会うまで彼らについてはほとんど何も知らなかった。固い団結力を不思議と感じていたバッドホップクルーのホームは川崎の南部だ。そこには東京湾に沿って多くの工場を抱える関東有数の工場地帯であり、周辺には在日韓国人のコミュニティも存在している。その場所で彼らはどんな日々を過ごしてきたのか、バッドホップには一体どんな人たちが集まっているのか、少ない情報と多くの疑問を持った私たちは直接川崎に向かって話を聞くことにした。
So within this, we can see how this narration is changing from first generation narration to the second generation narration to the third and fourth generation narration, where they tell the story of enclave, ethnic enclave, their history, but then they're in their own form of rap that really attracts the mainstream public as well. So as the first and second generation are fading into our history, how do we contain our history? How do we contain their existence, that there was an existence? And we see a lot of movements with Zainichi Koreans and also with our Japanese allies, really trying to make an effort into putting a lot of this history into living archives. On the left-hand side, we see the living archive in Osaka that just recently opened up. On the right-hand side, we see Utoro, the recent archive that it's an interactive archive that people can come, and a lot of school students, Japanese students, also Zainichi students and international students. And this has attracted a lot of international attention. And this is also part of the Seoul Journal of Korean Studies. We kind of talk about this as well for the winter special edition. So if you guys have any questions or comments, and if you would like to have some discussion, please contact me. And thank you so much for this opportunity to share. Thank you so much. And these are my references.
So thank you for the talk. Wow, I learned a lot. Now, I just had a small comment about the final part of the rap. Like actually, 10 years ago or something like that, New York Times featured an article about Hmong refugees in St. Paul, Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota. And that was also a rapper who tried to rap his own experience of the immigrant community. They all had to fled from northern Vietnam, I believe, and how that actually helps the community come together and also tells the story of the community. And it was quite interesting to see also that the rappers in Kawasaki are actually doing that. So you can see this kind of like using the media that's attractive to the mainstream population. In America, rap is popular. In Japan, rap is popular. So telling the stories through those kind of media can be an effective way of also telling your identity and also sharing more about what's going on as an immigrant, as a Black immigrant.
Absolutely. That's a really excellent point, because I think that for the younger generation, that is something that is a way for them to be able to share with the mainstream. And it really shows their contestation too. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. And I was wondering if there's some kind of program like cultural diversity awareness program, or maybe a linguistic diversity awareness program at the Japanese school level, or at the Japanese university or college level. And maybe if there's a program like this kind, the Chinese Korean story, this would be a perfect case or example for educating a lot of people who will lead the Japanese society in the future. What's your take?
Right. At the moment, Japan is very starting to move into that more and more this very conservative education. So I think that for us to be able to look upon a lot of this vernacular or fragmented speech, I think there would definitely be a lot of interest in it. But I think that would be for the university level. I think for the more of the elementary, junior, high school level, I think that it might be a very big challenge for Japan to transition or kind of look upon this as a focal point of one of their the cultural education classes. But it is a good point, because I think that Japan is starting to also understand the implications of multicultural, multi-ethnic recognition. And so this could be something that's really very exciting and helpful. And I think a lot of this archives serve in that role. So when a lot of the elementary school, junior high school do come on a field trips to these archives, they are able to kind of do interactive with the first generation or second generation who are living. They can also listen to a lot of their reporting and oral history, which I think a lot more attention needs to be on it. And that's the reason why I'm very grateful for you to give us this opportunity to talk more about this necessary needs for that attention. But I think, as Sung-Hoon and we talked about this morning, we are very much of a diasporic community, right? So Sung-Hoon and we were intermixing a lot of our languages, and we thought this is exactly, what connects us. And I think this is not only for Zainichi, but we have to say for Korean Americans, Koreans everywhere, Koreans in Germany, Koreans, in Japan. This is really a way for us to accept our fragmentation, to accept our accents, and how that really brings us or gives us that power to say, hey, I have an accent, so what? My accent has a history.
I thought it was very interesting in your talk when you mentioned about this moving away from this standardized form, which is usually the goal of language education in many countries. Like if you are Japanese, you have the standard Japanese, even the dialects are dispensed with. In Korean, nobody is saying that we should learn Gyeongsang Korean from now on. That's like not standard, but that with the dialect, at least it's a little bit more accepted. But I think even in Korea, also in Japan, there are many more communities other than Zainichi communities who are now having second generation, third generation. My university started to see increase of Nepalese students who were born in Nepal, but then they grew up in Japan, went to a Nepali school, which was based in English, and now they're trying to go to colleges, and like they have accents, of course, in the Japanese, also in the English. Do you have any thoughts about how to connect these kind of new group of immigrants? Like in Korea, relatively the immigrant community was small until now, but in Japan we had this huge Zainichi, there's this experience of Zainichi, how we can actually connect or perhaps make the discourse larger. So when other immigrant communities try to settle into Korea or Japan, they see the Zainichi Korean model as a, let's say, role model in terms of how we can settle in or what we can do for our next generation of children who want to now settle down in Japan or who only know about Japan or Korea. Like, if you have any thoughts there?
And I think that, like, for us to have a lot more discussions about the need to allow accent to be a part of the main vernacular, for us to get away and to contest this idea of standardized Korean, standardized Japanese or whatnot. And I think for the first generation, of course, they have the broken vernacular. Second generation speaks perfectly. Third generation, fourth generation speak perfectly. But artists, for example, these rappers, they utilize a lot of the broken vernacular of the first generation, incorporating a lot of the Western rap styles of speaking Japanese and also speaking the Korean chosengo like this. And it's this kind of abstract, this intermixing, this kind of gochamaze champong. And I think that really gives the flavor to the language. And we shouldn't negate from that, but we should embrace. But as you know, in Japan, this is a very hard challenge, right? And I don't know about the Korean context. To be able to speak Korean with a major accent is still probably frowned upon. But accents give flavor, and I want to really have our students understand accents gives a certain kind of characteristic to who you are. And so maybe we need to kind of change our viewpoint.
In Korea, we have now a parliamentary move to install anti-discrimination act, but it's a very hard and difficult process at the moment. No, not language. At our school, we are trying to promote diversity. Of course, we include the cultural diversity. So now we are, at the moment, we are teaching elective class. It's called coexistence. And 3 faculty members are co-teaching in this class, and we have about 30 people. And cultural diversity and gender, all these issues are key elements of the course. So at least we are trying this kind of activity. Yeah, it's very important and influential role to play. Yes. Thank you very much.